Well, good morning. Thank you for all coming out. I know we thought we might meet up with you when we were coming home on our flight, but as you know, hot weather in Washington, we had a lot of canceled flights coming back, so that didn't work out. But anyway, I'm happy to be here this morning. We got a lot of questions about the shutdown of the House, and so I'll give you a few details, but then you can just ask any questions that you're interested in. I got a call, I guess that we started session this week on Tuesday, and I got a call the day before from one of my colleagues, John Larson. He represents a district in Connecticut, and the Connecticut members have been particularly challenged by the issues of gun violence and the fact that something so horrific happened in Sandy Hook, and many of them have continued to sort of push for the Congress to do something about it. And John said, I've got this idea, we're also frustrated, we can't have a filibuster like Senator Murphy did in the House, but what do you think about some idea about stepping down on the House floor and just saying we're not going to move till something gets done? And, you know, that's how these ideas start. He said, I'm going to have a meeting right after our first votes in Congressman Lewis's office, John Lewis, and I think I've got about 10 people who are willing to come. Well, just like last night, my flight got canceled, but Jesse, my chief of staff, was able to go, and we got filled in, and the next morning, you know, he said, just meet down at the floor at 9:30, and we'll see what happens. And it's one of those things that, you know, just starts from a few people talking to each other. He hadn't even discussed it with our leadership, so it wasn't really a planned activity, and a handful of us came to the floor. We have a certain period between 10 and 12 where you're allowed to give a 5-minute talk about anything you want. So we discussed the issue, and then at some point people just said we're going to sit down and we're not going to move until something gets done. And that was the beginning of it. And before too long, pretty much all the members of our caucus came down to the floor. And for about 24 hours, we didn't have the normal order in the House. The Republicans came in at noon and just decided they didn't like what was going on, so they basically adjourned the House of Representatives, which means they turn off the C-SPAN cameras, they turn off the microphones, but we just kept talking, and without the normal rules that sort of constrict us, people got up and gave some of the most emotional and personal stories I think I've ever heard many of my colleagues give. We have a lot of restrictions in the House, so you can usually only speak for a minute or 2 minutes, but people were allowed to talk for as long as they wanted. And it just kept going on. So it ended up being, you know, I think a very good way to let the American public know that we hear them, we get calls to our office all the time. Why doesn't Congress get something done? You know, aren't you upset after what happened in Orlando? And why don't you have a conversation about this? So we had a chance to do that, as you know, because the C-SPAN cameras were out. One of my colleagues decided to try a little social media, and even though it's against the rules of the House to take a picture or anything like that, before you know it, people had their iPhones going, and they said to the Republicans, look, if you're going to turn off the C-SPAN cameras, you know, we're going to have to do whatever we have to do to get the message out. So C-SPAN decided to cover it. It looked a little bit like a clandestine reporting from a basement somewhere. But the basic idea behind it wasn't necessarily about any bill in particular, but the idea was people have become so afraid in Congress of having any kind of dialogue, any constructive dialogue, any rational debate about what to do about gun violence in our country. And the Republicans will never bring the bills to the floor, which means we don't have any open conversation about it. They won't take a vote. There are 2 bipartisan bills that are out there right now, somewhat similar to what the Senate had voted on. And we just said, take a vote. You know, it would probably pass, but they've been very unwilling to have the votes on this. And our feeling is, look, we get paid to represent the American public. We're paid to do really difficult jobs. We're not just supposed to sit back and, you know, read the polling numbers and decide what's difficult and say we're not going to do it. So our goal was just to get the conversation going, to push our colleagues into doing that. I think my opinion is it made the Republican leadership very nervous. They came back in at midnight, took up one bill around a Wall Street loophole. Then they decided they just wanted to get out of town, so they took up a couple of other bills very quickly. We finished voting at 3:30 in the morning, and then we just went back to continuing this dialogue about gun safety and some of the bills that are before us. So it didn't change everything in a week, but our feeling was the public is very upset this year about business as usual in politics. They have a very low level of confidence in Congress, and we just want to let people know we hear them. And we feel frustrated too, and if it meant we had to stop the action and everybody just went home, we were willing to do that. So I think it did change the conversation. I think it opened up the debate. I think people, as I said, told amazing personal stories, and people were glued to C-SPAN listening to this conversation. And we're hoping that, very much like what happened in the Senate about 10 days ago when Senator Murphy got up feeling really frustrated. He also didn't go to his leadership and ask. He just started talking about, the Sandy Hook massacre of little children. He talked about what it was like to meet those families, and he just kept the conversation going, and eventually their leadership agreed to take up 4 bills. As you know, those bills in the Senate didn't pass, but it brought us to the point now where we have Senator Collins and other members of the Senate working on compromises. And again, at least the American public can feel like, well, you're moving forward. You're trying to do something about this. The calls to our office were overwhelmingly positive. People really kept the phones ringing the whole time. And this funny thing happened, when you have to stay up all night and you have to, there's a little cloakroom off the floor. People started sending pizza deliveries and food. About 30 of the senators came over to join us and to be part of the conversation. And, as you know, United States senators don't usually want to come over to the House of Representatives. We were surprised they knew the way. But they brought food and they brought snacks, and they came in sort of solidarity for wanting to get something done. And we heard from the pizza places in D.C. They couldn't keep up with all the orders from people around the country just trying to send Congress pizzas, and it was great. It was just it looked like a college dorm by the end of the night. There's no beer, but there was a lot of pizza boxes and people sleeping with blankets and pillows, and I guess really feeling like, okay, it seems kind of silly that the House of Representatives would have to go and occupy the floor to get something done, but we were lucky enough to be accompanied by our colleague John Lewis, who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge and did a lot of sit-ins over his time, and was a very good instructor in just calmly sit here and say, I'm going to sit here till something gets done. And as he said, by sitting down you're standing up, and so that was how we felt. We got to stand up for this issue and we got to do something about it. So I'm happy to answer any questions or give you any more details.
After the recess, you guys go back to Washington. What happens next?
I don't know.
What bill are you going to try to get passed?
Like I said, I would be really happy if Congress would take up any bill, a compromise bill, a dialogue, but the idea of at least having a conversation, getting some debate going, taking up more of these bills in committee. We all have different opinions about how to go about doing this, and there are some simple bills before the House, bipartisan, around very similar to what Senator Collins is doing around making sure that terrorists don't have easy access to guns, the FBI has more information, background check bills. I think there's a lot we can do, all of which is very popular with the public. It's not as if we're going way out on a limb or taking away people's guns or all the things you hear about. This is just to tell people we hear about the problem and we're worried about it too. Yeah.
Do you think the NRA continues to be very strong?
Well, they've certainly been extremely negative about what's gone on in the House and the Senate and very oppositional. So they've always played a big role in opposing anything to do with gun safety. We can't even pass a bill in the House. It's been shot down before to allow the CDC to research the statistics around gun violence. And what does that tell you about this problem if we're afraid to even deal with rational research? But that's the kind of thing that they block at every turn. And I think it's the kind of thing that makes the American public feel like we're not listening, we're not paying attention, that we don't see these are horrendous tragedies, and it's our job to do something, at least to explore what we can do to fix it.
Congressman Poliquin, as the only member of Maine's congressional delegation to be silent on this issue, what's your reaction to that?
Each one of us has to decide the best way to handle these issues and, how to deal with our own thoughts about them. I believe that people in Maine are ready for us to have some very sensible rules and very sensible laws about this, and I hope we get these bills to the floor, and I hope, like some of his other Republican colleagues, he'll choose to vote in favor of them.
Congresswoman,
yeah.
A lot of your Republican colleagues were not in favor of this sit-in. Speaker Ryan went as far to call it a political stunt. I recall him reading out loud some fundraising email solicitations that were sent out by the Democratic committee. If it wasn't a political stunt, why did that happen?
Well, my office didn't fundraise off of it, and I don't think that was anybody's intention. It wasn't planned. As I said, one member, John Larson from Connecticut, just said, I'm frustrated, I can't take it anymore. He got together a group of members, and we went to the floor, and it just kind of kept happening. I know he called it a publicity stunt, but I just think to disregard the tragedies that have gone on, the hurt and the pain that all these families have gone through and continue to feel, the gun tragedies in our country, they're just not publicity stunts for those families. Those are Those are just horrendous incidents, and they're looking at us all the time saying, why is it you guys aren't paying any attention? Why don't you do anything about this? So I feel pretty much the opposite. I also feel like, we're elected to tackle these tough issues. Our job is to handle difficult problems, to answer the tough questions, at least to ask the tough questions, and to open up this dialogue to our whole country. And not only did you have this opportunity for people to keep talking about this issue for 24 hours, but we had it all out there on social media, and the truth is people were engaging this dialogue. People were having fights back and forth on Twitter and Facebook and Periscope and all these places, and that's what we're there to do. That's not really a publicity stunt. That's an actual dialogue, and if the House of Representatives Speaker Ryan won't let us have it during the regular course of the day, we were just trying to think up something that allowed us to do it.
This has been an issue that's divided a lot of people across the country, but with the exception, like we just heard, of Congressman Poliquin, who we haven't heard from. Aside from him, it seems that Maine's delegation, as far as a no-fly legislation, is all on the same page. What do you think that says about the beliefs here from you and your colleagues in the Senate?
I think we should feel very good about the state of Maine. I think we should be really proud of Senator Collins and Senator King for being willing to speak out on this, for Senator Collins to try to look for a reasonable compromise. And we see that a lot in the state of Maine. Look, we're a gun-owning state. People in every community love to hunt. They love to own guns. They have a tradition of responsible gun ownership. And I think it says a lot when you have a state that has these kind of feelings where we're also saying, yeah, but where do we draw the line, and what are appropriate protections, and how do we have the right background checks, and what do we do about terrorism? So I think it's an important dialogue to have, and I think we should all be really proud of our own state.
How are Maine voters? Do you have a sense of how many Maine voters, support some sort of gun legislation?
From what I've seen of polling data, Maine voters are very much in support of reasonable background checks. This this terrorism legislation that would basically find a way so that if you were a suspected terrorist, basically if you can't fly on an airplane, and we're already prohibiting you from doing that, should we just say you can walk down the street and buy a gun? It seems to me we should look at those two things together. And they're very strongly supported nationally and in our own state. And one of the interesting things, taking this away from being a partisan issue, they're more strongly supported in polling data by Republicans than Democrats. And I think some of that has to do with Republicans having an acute sense of worry about terrorism and terrorist incidents in our state. And they're just saying, hey, when are you going to do something about this?
So where do you go from here?
Well, I have no idea. There's been a lot of conversation in our caucus, just as there has been in the Senate, about how do we move forward, how do we move a very recalcitrant House of Representatives that's been kind of a do-nothing Congress, and has now had this little burst of energy, and our constituents saying, okay, keep going. So we'll come back. They've adjourned till the day after the 4th of July, and we'll be talking to each other and to our constituents about what to move this forward. The real challenge in the House of Representatives, unlike the United States Senate, which the United States Senate has rules where one person can have a filibuster till they can't talk anymore. One person can hold a bill. It's just a very different place. In the House, the majority party basically controls everything. It's just how the rules have set up in the United States House of Representatives. So there aren't a lot of ways for us to bring a bill to the floor or to bring a bill into committee. And the Republicans currently are operating under what they call the Hastert Rule, which is an unfortunate name, but it goes back to Speaker Hastert when they will only bring a bill before the House of Representatives that will be passed by the majority of the majority. So what that means is, all the compromise legislation, which, unlike what you hear, there's a lot of things we're more than willing to compromise on, and there's a lot of bipartisan bills, but the Republican leadership won't take up a bill if it needs some Democrats and some Republicans to pass. So if we could get them to change that one rule and say they'll bring bills to the floor, even if you need members of both parties to pass it, we would have the opportunity to get a lot more done. So I'm just hoping this shines a light on it, that the American public, sees that there are ways to go about doing it, that they put pressure on the members of the House in both parties and just said, look, we want you to do something, and we've heard the dialogue, and you should keep moving on it.
You mentioned that you're willing to compromise. Do you know what kinds of compromises the Democrats are willing to have going forward?
Well, gun legislation goes from, outright bans on assault weapons to bills like this senator has been working on that, deal with the no-fly list and some of the known terrorist suspects and just prohibiting them from getting guns. So I would be open to all suggestions. And honestly, I think if we could start moving, sometimes you just take up one bill that moves the debate forward and people see that it can pass, and then they get the confidence and say, well, let's discuss this more. But it's not even so much about what bill we pass. It's the idea that right now we're not even having the conversation. We don't even get to have a reasonable debate around it unless we take over the House floor and show it on our iPhones. But that 24 hours of iPhone debate and dialogue was actually pretty interesting to the American public. It makes me think they'd like to see more of it.
Was there talk about doing another one? Did that come up?
It certainly has come up, but whether that's what people will decide to do after we come back, I don't know. It could be the right way to go about doing it.
You're talking about a lot of frustration, it sounds like, on that side of the Democrats. Is things like sit-ins, is this your only recourse? Is this like it?
I mean, it's kind of nutty to think that, members of the House of Representatives have to sit down on the floor of the House and say, we're not going away till you do something. But the rules of the House are very constraining, and we can't bring a bill to the floor. We can't take it up in committee. And we feel like the Republicans are even not listening to their own members, that there are many of the Republicans who would like to see this happen too. It's not a partisan issue. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. So I think it's surprising to people that that's what it took. And in a way, I respect the decorum of the House and, hate the idea that that's what we have to do. But as I said before, this is an unusual political season where the American public is so frustrated. In fact, maybe people around the world are feeling frustrated. And they're just saying, why did I elect these people if they're not going to do anything? And if it takes sitting on the floor of the House with John Lewis, that's what we're going to do.
I know we asked you what happens next, and you said it's unclear, but what about for you personally? What do you do regarding this issue the second you get back to D.C., and is this now your top priority out of all the things you deal with in the House?
It can't possibly be my top priority. I'm sorry to say there are so many issues before us, economic issues, the cost of education. I mean, we have a lot on our plate, and we have a lot on our plate that we should be dealing with, and Congress is the House of Representatives is in the thick of our budget passing cycle, and so we're working on everything from Homeland Security to the cost of education and environmental issues. So there's a lot on our plate, but I do hope that we haven't, stopped the conversation around this dialogue. And, I'll go back right after the 4th of July and get back to work, but there's a lot of issues that we'll be dealing with that week.
At one point, the mantra was no bill, no break, but yet you guys broke. Do you think it would have been more effective had you guys continued the sit-in for as long as it took?
Well, we would have, yes, I think it would have been, I think it would be great if we could continue the sit-in. Basically we were hoping that we could convince the Republicans not to go home, but as I said, they adjourned in the middle of the night, stopped at 3:30 in the morning, and just kind of all took off, and so we didn't have a Congress really there anymore. I think there will be members going in every day. The House is in what's called pro forma, so they can continue to go in and speak on the floor. It certainly won't be the same, but maybe when we get back, something similar to this will happen, or maybe we'll think up another idea that's kind of out of the box, but it keeps the conversation going.
Who's going to win in November?
This is very possibly one of the most unpredictable election cycles of all of our lifetimes, and as they say, a week is a long time in politics, so you tell me. Well, thank you all. Anybody else have any last questions? Thanks very much for coming. Really appreciate your coming out on such a, a hard day and getting a little sun, but thank you very much.